At this point, it's a safe bet to assume you've at least heard of Palworld. It's taken over the internet, or at least my timeline and my timelines, and if the amount of "welp, muting Palworld" tweets I've seen in the time since its release are any indication. As a massive Pokemon fan that in large part got into making videos as a result of my desire to voice my criticisms and adoration for the franchise alike in the first place, it was inevitable that had Palworld been successful to any real degree, I'd have to check it out and share my thoughts and experiences. And if it wasn't obvious, it has certainly fulfilled that requirement. So here we are, that's what this is. I played the video game for several hours, and I have a ton of thoughts on that front, as well as the controversy in and outside of the game, and the cherry on top will be some thoughts on what Palworld does that Pokemon could learn from. We'll be here for a bit, so strap in, and I don't know, maybe subscribe while you're here. It's free, and I'll do my best to inform, or at the very least entertain, I promise. Now, to rip the band-aid off, I hate Palworld. And to be honest, I hate that I hate Palworld. Not because I think my hate is unwarranted, we'll get to why that is in great detail. The video game thinks I'm in water because I am near water. So how do I actually heal them? Is it like did this crash? But rather because if not for the laundry list of issues I have with Palworld, there's a lot of personal incentive to champion its success. But everything about where it falls short to where it wildly misses the mark makes it impossible to do so. That said, there are things that I do think Palworld does well that make me honestly sad that my many grievances exist in the first place, that I do think are worthy of praise in isolation. So we'll start with some pros and cons. Eventually, those pros will run out, but I do think it's worth highlighting what even I do think Palworld does not only well, but better than Pokemon. The genre and minute-to-minute gameplay, for the most part, fits the world of Pokemon a lot better than mainline Pokemon games genre and gameplay currently do. When Pokemon Company releases any kind of media, the way Pokemon are depicted there are nowhere near as bland as the game's turn-based RPG battle system would suggest. There's so much more energy than simply, my Pokemon can use 4 moves and I will take turns with my opponent's Pokemon that also only can use 4 moves until one of us wins. In every other visual medium Pokemon exists in, battles are frenetic and allow for things like positioning, environmental quirks, individual Pokemon's personalities and sensibilities, and more. On top of the fact that there's so many more ways to engage with Pokemon in the world than just those battles alone. While Palworld's gameplay doesn't exactly translate all of this one for one, it does a way better job at being a more direct analog of what Pokemon has become, or arguably what it always was intended to be if it weren't for the series debuting on the Game Boy in the mid-90s, by changing the genre to be more of an action RPG based survival game. And no way am I saying the survival genre is what Pokemon needs to be, by the way. That would be a mismatch to be sure. But even a lot of those elements would be apt and welcome additions in Pokemon. It wouldn't be in line with Pokemon to make death a part of the gameplay. But Pokemon do eat. Pokemon do get tired. Pokemon can assist with tasks outside of battling. Palworld, accounting for all of that, makes sense for the world we've been sold even within the Pokemon games, but never actually get to see make any real impact on the gameplay. Similarly, in Palworld, the player character gets to take part in the action. Unlike the survival gameplay, this is something that Pokemon flirted with in Legends Arceus, and having seen them do that, I can say 2 things. 1, it's something that improves the experience, so it's worth doing. And 2, it doesn't fit Pokemon in the way it exists in Palworld, nor does it honestly fit in the way it exists in Arceus either. I think the player character in Pokemon physically engaging in the world they live in rather than essentially being in God mode while insane things are happening a few feet in front of their faces makes a lot of sense. Sakurai captured the way Pokemon trainers currently seem to exist in Pokemon games through the Pokemon trainer character in Smash Bros, and you gotta admit, this is a ridiculous thing to assume happens whenever there's a Pokemon battle going on. It would make more sense for them to exist outside of this metaphorical bubble, and it's something that is also already regularly showcased in Pokemon media outside of the mainline games. Ash tried to fight Mewtwo. Team Rocket gets directly attacked by Pokemon in like 90% of the episodes they appear in. And even if we remove the idea of humans being directly involved in battle with Pokemon, which I don't even have a desire to do, to. I'd also like it less if the idea was the trainer being an active physical participant in the fighting. In all of my hours playing Palworld, I have never encountered a small cliff my character couldn't get over without the assistance of their pals. Meanwhile, your player character in Pokemon can't say the same. I mean, seriously, in Scarlet and Violet, they start to drown the moment their feet can't touch the ground in a body of water. Now, I know not everyone can swim, but I know for a fact that most able-bodied people wouldn't be as fragile as the player characters in Pokemon games. Or on the more extreme angle, I've seen Ash jump off of cliffs onto moving hot air balloons in an effort to save his Pokemon from Team Rocket. And again, I'm not necessarily requesting to be afforded the ability to do the same. All I'm saying is if we can get some sort of averaging out of the feats of an average able-bodied human in the real significantly less fantastical world, and Ash Ketchum in mainline Pokemon video games, that'd be great. On that topic, to expand on it, Palworld has better traversal than Pokemon games, both objectively in terms of the actual act of being able to travel through the world functionally. Mostly, this is less true with the Indigo Disc allowing flight, but also superficially with the ability to use several different pals as mounts that sport different attributes and reasons to use one over another, which has always been something I've wanted to see in Pokemon games since the first time I saw Ash's Charizard carrying him through the sky in the anime. Or that one scene in Pokemon the movie where all the trainers Mewtwo invited to his island made their way there by using their various Pokemon to make it through the storm by sea and sky. At present, Pokemon games have only ever designated specific Pokemon to visually fulfill these tasks. Obviously, this has no direct negative impact on the ability to get around, but it's hard to argue it's not a lot cooler to be able to use your individual favorite Pokemon in various categories to accomplish different tasks. To go further here, in Palworld, this is also true for doing other tasks around your bases. This is something Pokemon have been said and shown to be able to do in various ways, but has yet to actually make its way to gameplay. That goes from things like water-type pals helping to put out fires, all the way to more simple things like fire-type pals with open flames on their person, lighting the way in dark areas of the world. Pokemon would objectively be better with a similar level of attention to detail in their game. And there's other examples like that I could cherry pick, but suffice to say, most of them are on this line of thought. Palworld, in more ways than one, takes things from different elements of Pokemon or things that would just make sense in its world and translates them to gameplay for the first time ever, which is cool. As far as cons, to be quite honest, the biggest downfall here is kind of impossible to rectify, and that's the fact that Palworld ultimately isn't, nor could it ever actually be, Pokemon. Like, it's cool that I can fly around on a Vanworm or whatever, but I'll never do that without wishing it was me flying around on a Charizard instead. Some of that is down to my individual lived experiences and preferences, to be sure, but the near 30 years Pokemon Company has spent crafting a world worth fantasizing about in this way cannot be understated. Could it be what Pokemon was for me the moment I first discovered it for someone that's 5 and seeing it for the first time ever, like I did with Pokemon when I was the same age? Well, they probably shouldn't for reasons I'll get to, but you get the point. I think they still have a lot of catching up to do if they hope to compete here, I think. The next thing Palworld does better than Pokemon is the multiplayer aspect of the game. Sort of. Currently, Pokemon functionally has more that can be done with friends in their latest mainline game, playtime-wise, as there's currently no PvP in Palworld. It's on the roadmap, but we can only really speak to what we've seen, and we haven't seen what PvP will even mean in Palworld, let alone if it will be good. What I can say is good right now, even despite this, is the foundation of Palworld's online multiplayer, in the Steam version specifically, as that version allows for dedicated servers with up to 32 players each, which rectifies some of the issues I'm gonna get into here, but certainly not all. Palworld's multiplayer allows between 4 and, again for the Steam version, 32 players to play together in one seamless world, where they can form guilds to build bases and work together to accrue resources they can then use to battle and capture bosses, alongside other pals, obviously. I spent many more hours playing this game than I would have otherwise for its multiplayer features alone. Those features include the ability to take on story quests alongside your group of friends, something you'd, or at least I'd, assume from a game like this, but Pokemon has admittedly done a bad job at implementing at all, let alone implement well. Base building is something that while Pokemon Company and Game Freak have never focused on in Pokemon games or lore, has certainly seen rudimentary versions introduced in former Pokemon releases. Guild management is different though, as it hasn't been something Pokemon has even attempted, but very well could have its own version that's a natural fit in the Pokemon world if they wanted there to be something like it. And cooperative boss battles are cool and all, but I don't see myself wanting to challenge gym leaders with friends, although watching them battle gym leaders in real time could be cool. Battling them together, I think, goes against the spirit of what the gym challenge is meant to be though. But they could have players team up against the evil crime syndicates in future games and it fit perfectly. All of that said, not all of Palworld's multiplayer features are my ideal collection of multiplayer features for future Pokemon games. That by no means says there isn't a ton Pokemon could stand to learn from Palworld on this front, but these features are far from perfect and in some ways are even noticeably worse than Pokemon's latest swing at persistent multiplayer, despite being able to utilize much more powerful hardware with online infrastructure that's a lot more sophisticated than what's currently available on Switch, or at least that's the narrative. On one end, on a base level, the world's progress isn't tied to the player in Palworld. It's tied to individual servers, or outside of the Steam version, individual players' saves that friends can drop in and out of. That means whenever you want to play with a new set of friends and a different save or server, you not only need to progress through the game again, you even need to make your character over again, which is ridiculous considering how Pokemon Scarlet and Violet not only allow you to enter anyone's Union Circle with your current progress intact, both before, during, and after you join or leave a Union Circle, it even combines elements from both versions of the game, like version exclusive Pokemon being brought into the Union Circle from the versions that are currently being used. On one hand, I guess Palworld benefits from this on some level, but not in a good way. I have certainly spent dozens more hours playing Palworld than I would have otherwise if it weren't for how poorly executed their multiplayer solution is at the launch of the Game Pass version. The friends I've been playing through the game with all have their progress tied to my save, so I have to play with them lest I leave them hanging, forcing them to start all over again. As I'm at my wit's end with this game for reasons I have yet to get to, my current solution is booting up my save, sharing the code with my friends, and letting my Xbox sit on the home screen until the game inevitably freezes or has some other bug that forces me to reset the whole thing. Which brings me to this game's abysmal performance on non-Steam versions of the game. And also, let's be real, the Steam version runs better, but it still isn't a polished game by any means. And I know, early access, but that title is more of an excuse to monetize the recruitment of people to bug and or stress test your unfinished product than it is a reason to pity or give passes to a game you're still paying real money to play. I digress. On to the performance section. I'll be upfront here and say, more often than not, I genuinely do not care about performance. I have been a console gamer all of my life. I started being engaged with the medium during the era of slowdown on the N64, and the stuff that kept me playing then ultimately is most of what I prioritize or often even care about at all now. Does the game have designs that make me want to play it? Is the game fun once I do? Sick, then I'm sold. It rarely gets more complicated than that. Now, with that in mind, does performance straight up never matter? No, I'd be lying if I said that was the case. The only, and I mean only time a game's performance is of any concern to me at all is when it makes it impossible or even noticeably harder to physically play the game I am playing or am trying to play. In other words, if a game's performance impacts my performance while playing said game, that is a problem, and that is something that is a deal breaker for me. So, with Pokemon, where the bulk of the experience is scrolling through menus, when the conversation devolves into the internet complaining about frame pacing in a Pokemon game, I am deeply confused and even at times angry that this is what we're complaining about, when in my opinion, the real problem is the fact that the gameplay is scrolling through a series of menus in the first place, not how those cutscenes on the screen play. So fast forward to now with Palworld, a game that has done its part in addressing the gameplay concern. For the most part, you still don't actually have control over the battle outside of your trainer themselves. Your pals kind of just have sign Sonic Adventure Chow Karate matches for the most part, but I digress. This game's performance is abysmal. I have fallen through the map on several occasions, nearly losing my resources in the process, which is the gameplay. The game frequently drops frames and lags during fights, which in an action game means I frequently get hit or even die as a result of not being able to react to what is happening. In Pokemon, more often than not, the frames dropping means I lose a second or two of my life at most. All the while, I see people still bashing the latter and praising the former. And to be clear, there has been one bug in Pokemon that has amounted to more than the dreaded immersion breaking in the game about catching an electric rat in a ball made from a fruit. And the bug in question is when Pokemon spawn inside of mountains that can't be seen or reached by the trainer, which is very annoying. Does it break the game? Nope. I can still auto battle and even initiate regular battles by throwing one of my Pokemon's Pokeballs at them. Or the 3 total times Pokemon Scarlet has crashed on me in over a year on the market and well over 600 hours played. That's the worst bugs get for Pokemon. Meanwhile, Palworld crashed on me a total of 16 times in the week or so I actively played it. Look at how slow I am moving. What? What the f? The game crashed!
Yeah, that happened to me too.
What level did you get the shit for the mount?
I didn't get to check.
The shit crashed. Bro, let me respawn. I can't respawn. That's insane. And I know what the only rebuttals to this will be. It's a small team. Pocketpair themselves call this into question with claims that they can't even quantify the resources that went into this game given their use of freelancers and other means that make it harder to put an exact number to. And even with it being a small team, there are pros and cons to big and small teams. You'd be surprised how many people it actually takes to make the heart of a game. Teams getting bigger doesn't necessarily lead to games being easier to develop, and actually frequently leads to the opposite. And the second retort is honestly a brain dead one. It's early access. A developer choosing to monetize their alpha testing phase is not an excuse or an explanation. It's marketing. And while you can choose to believe that marketing term is worthy of pretending a product is better than it actually is in practice, by all means, do that. But let's not pretend it's a valid retort to people that don't opt to do the same. I am paying money to play this video game. It's not my job to pretend it's good. It's their job to make it good, or maybe take the fact that it isn't good as motivation for it to reach that lofty goal. Some believe the early access title should allow developers the benefit of the doubt. I believe that's something you earn through providing a quality experience over a period of time. They haven't done that. All they did was offer anti-Pokemon in the promise that it will eventually be a complete product. I'm not in the business of giving a completely unproven developer that level of blind faith. And I just personally think it's crazy that the same people that were crying about some frame drops in a turn-based RPG are willing to have that blind faith in a game like this that performs like it does. Now, this is the part of the video where I plan to talk about Palworld's story and lore, but to be quite honest with you, I have no idea what it is. To its credit, the game does what I would say is a good thing and ultimately makes actually engaging with any of it optional. But it also does the terrible thing of making it easy to not care about it enough to want to opt in to find out about any of its lore. I considered doing some cursory research to compare it with Pokemon on a quality level, but I think the fact that I don't care to look into it in the first place, even with the incentive of being able to do my job better, speaks enough to its quality before having to read a single word of dialogue. Maybe I'm missing some good stuff and they just don't know how to bring it enough to the surface to lead me to dig deeper. I sincerely doubt it, but if you beg to differ, feel free to fill me in on that in the comments. All of that is to say, on the story front, Pokemon games are pretty mid. Even the best of them, I think, are serviceable, very surface level, baby's first philosophy tales at best, and not much to write home about. The lore and world building, on the other hand, is some of the best I've personally experienced in any franchise I've engaged with, so yeah, they do have some steep competition there, in my opinion. Speaking of competition, let's talk plagiarism. The most popular, or I guess unpopular con, admittedly, contrary to the common assumption I'm sure many have for a Pokemon fan that hates Palworld, I actually care very little, if at all, about the plagiarism controversy. It wouldn't be the first property to blatantly rip off Pokemon, and it won't be the last. It's not even close to the first successful property to ride Pokemon's coattails, and all of those forebearers do have an identity of their own beyond edgy Pokemon clone. And while I never really became a fan of any of them, Veemon's pretty cool, and I own and played Yokai Watch thanks to Nintendo sending me the first few on 3DS a while back, and there are others that, while I never cared to give them the time of day for one reason or another, I can't say I ever actually disliked any of them either. All of that said, none of that actually helps Palworld free itself of these allegations. It beyond a shadow of a doubt rips off Pokemon. That said, not to the degree many are accusing it of, nor is it in the manner its defenders are attempting to defend it from. There are some completely original pals. There are some pals with some noteworthy inspiration from Pokemon and other properties, and there are some pals that are shameless, blatant ripoffs of Pokemon and again, other properties as well. That said, there are some things that Palworld does to set itself apart from Pokemon, most of which I talked about in the opening gameplay section. However, even those things don't free it from the clutches of these copyright infringement allegations because, first of all, most people's current defenses regarding this issue isn't Palworld doesn't steal from Pokemon, it's to what extent it steals from Pokemon. And the answer there usually comes alongside the attempted make-good rebuttal that it not only steals from Pokemon, but rather it steals from other games as well. And even more than that, more important to note than any of that, as I have been droning on about in most parts of this and other videos, Pokemon is much more than just the mainline turn-based RPGs that people think these allegations live and die by. Pokemon also exists as an anime, and movies, and card game, and toys, and spin-off series. I can go on. All of these inspire what the brand is and will become. Palworld plagiarizing the games isn't the issue. And that's not to say it doesn't copy the games. There's a notable amount of stealing in that area too. But more importantly, it is to say what it takes from Pokemon games isn't the important part. What Palworld does blatantly copy is the broader Pokemon brand, and despite the gaming community's assumptions, this is an even bigger deal than if it did just take from the games, because the wider Pokemon brand as it exists across mediums is why it is an unmatched transmedia behemoth to begin with. A lot of people seem to be under the assumption that the American fair use doctrine is enough to protect Palworld. It's parody, many will say. There's no way Pokemon Company could have a case. Newsflash, copyright law is a lot more complicated than you think if you think that's the case here, or honestly, most of these defenses I've seen on the internet in an attempt to save Palworld if it is determined that it tangibly does steal from Pokemon. Like in straight up using their models in their video game kind of stealing. And to be clear, the amount of stolen doesn't particularly matter all that much beyond the possibility and or ease of removal for any possible infringement. For example, if they are found to have Pokemon models in their game, that will be enough to take their game down, unless or until they remove any stolen assets. Ever heard of Only Up? That's a game that's no longer on Steam. Palworld could face a similar fate. And to be honest, it may even be easier for Pokemon Company to get to that end result, as these are two Japanese companies, which means one, fair use isn't much of a concern here, and two, international law isn't even something they really need to be concerned about to begin with, let alone fair use specifically. Japanese copyright laws are enough to make a major impact, and they are way less in favor of possible loopholes for copying the work of others. Not acknowledging all of these things are very true has made the internet discourse surrounding these games re this topic, especially internet discoursey, hurting the strength of anyone's particular argument before they get anywhere if they even part their lips to mention these two games in close proximity to each other. Everybody is tired of talking about this game, and the face value explanation as to why is the two sides of the argument are stupid, but in reality, a lot of them are just acting in bad bad faith. No one is willing to admit any level of gray for fear of the argument being anything outside of the black and white issue they decided it is, and always will be, means the personality they crafted for themselves is flawed. There's nothing wrong with seeing yourself in the media you consume. The problem, in my opinion, is when you're dishonest about what it is you decide to rally behind in the process. A great example of this is how the flavor of the moment's controversy, AI, has made its way into this without any tangible proof one way or another. I don't think AI really changes absolutely anything in the ripoff conversation. I don't care if intellectual property was stolen by humans or an algorithm. If it was stolen, it was stolen, and that is the problem. Adding AI into it is just a thinly veiled attempt to play to the internet's blanket disdain for the technology, and that just makes the conversation even more disingenuous than it's already been, and that's saying a lot. Blindly and universally fighting for or against a side in the fanboy or even brewing culture war that is happening right now in relation to this isn't something I'm interested in being a part of. So I'll say it plainly. Does Palworld rip off Pokemon? In some ways, absolutely. It does that and more. In some ways, it rips off Pokemon. In some ways, it rips off other things. But in some ways, it is genuinely wholly original, or what in my opinion is tastefully inspired by other properties. And at the end of the day, I'm not interested in offering an armchair verdict on if any of that spectrum is the legal Goldilocks ratio to say it is or isn't guilty of theft and therefore should be shut down and undo all of its success. All of that said, I do have some more direct thoughts on Palworld's success, so let's get into that. Palworld's success in and of itself is another point of contention in my mind for a couple of reasons. And to be clear, this is another element of this discussion that I personally wish didn't come part and parcel with these asterisks, but I'd be just like every other person on the internet that seems to feel this situation is or should be black and white, open and shut, if I didn't get into it, accounting for as much as possible. I always strive to at least try to be more than that, so here we are. Palworld, the last major sales update that can be directly aligned with Pokemon at the time of writing this video, is 8 million units sold in the first 5 days of release. This figure is for the game's Steam release, which, I'll state plainly, is phenomenal. Any game selling this many copies at all, let alone in its first week on the market, is something worth celebrating. And that's without looking at the Game Pass numbers, which we don't have access to for this time frame, but with there being well over 30 million people with access to the game for free by way of Game Pass, you have to imagine a good portion of them downloaded and checked out the game. Again, this is good. This many people choosing to devote their time downloading and playing your game is notable. This, though, is where narratives begin to form and muddy how worthy of celebration this game's success is when viewed from the context it's forced to contend with. Some of that was asked for through its marketing as well as other factors the Palworld developers placed upon themselves. But a lot of it is internet people crafting narratives to make themselves feel better about themselves for championing a side. This then leads to comparing sales from Pokemon. This is a comparison that I argue is 1, a losing one for Palworld, and 2, an unfair comparison to begin with, even if Palworld didn't come up short in the sales department. To say why, let's start with a simple question. What did Pokemon sell? In its first 3 days on the market, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet sold 10 million units, and not only that, it's worth noting that Palworld is a $30 game, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are $60. Palworld even had a launch sale on Steam, which even if we ignore and assume every sale was for full MSRP, not only did it sell less units, it generated half the amount of revenue for every one of those units sold. To circle back to the second part then, about the comparison being unfair from the offset, on one end, the comparison isn't fair because no matter how it did, it will always have the asterisk of being a new IP, a disclaimer that I take issue with as it is yet another disingenuous half-truth. Sure, Palworld is technically a new IP, but let's not pretend it's operating as one here, because anyone with a brain could tell you it's not that simple, because Palworld isn't succeeding at large on its own merits as a game as most new IP would need to, which is typically the impressive part of new franchises succeeding. Now, that's not to say it's not a fun game. I definitely think it is in a lot of ways, but to pretend Palworld's proximity to Pokemon and its marketing being positioned as it being the answer to problems that Pokemon fans have been screaming about isn't the majority of why people care to even find out it was enjoyable from the door is ridiculous. Meanwhile, if we look at Pokemon, when it was the new kid on the block, it succeeded in spite of its inspiration. I'm sure you've seen this image floating around the internet with illustrations of Dragon Quest Monster Collection game, and I'm positive the vast majority of you learned of the now nebulous connection it shares with Pokemon during this current controversy, rather than at any other point in its nearly 40 years of existence. And that's because Pokemon was, from day one, vastly more successful than not only the Dragon Quest spin-off Monster Collection games that inspired it, but the entire Dragon Quest brand as a whole. Pokemon was never positioned as the anti-Dragon Quest. In fact, Game Freak wore that inspiration on their sleeve in a very positive way and used that inspiration to make something that ultimately grew to become something else entirely. Palworld's version of using a muse as a foundation to set yourself apart is to try to blur the lines of inspiration by taking from several muses to hopefully come out on the other side with something wholly unique as a result, or kit bashing. I'll leave it up to you to decide if they succeeded in that. I point all of that out to say it's impossible to genuinely conclude that Palworld's success is some sort of indictment of Pokemon, because not only would it not exist if Pokemon didn't provide not only the foundation, but the entire skeleton and a lot of the meat on those bones. On top of that, no one would care about Palworld were it not for Pokemon in its current place in the way it actively exists today in the zeitgeist. And again, as evidenced by the fact that most people didn't even know of the Dragon Quest connection with Pokemon, it's hard to argue the same is or ever was true for Pokemon and its inspiration. And there's also this graph that breaks down the Palworld demographic that's noteworthy given these markets, what they respond to, and why. It says a lot. I'll leave it up to you to individually come to a conclusion on what that is. Moving on. Open this video by saying I hate this game, and while I touched on some of those reasons on the way to where we are now in the video, none of that stuff scratches the surface. Really, the only aspect of Palworld that comes anywhere close to this is the edgy counterculture for the sake of being edgy and contrarian brand it has crafted for itself. Part of that identity is made possible by my individual biggest problem with Palworld, the most important con, the very literal slavery. For as long as Pokemon existed, edgy armchair philosophers have insisted that Pokemon is ultimately a franchise about slavery and dogfighting. This debate has always existed, and I'm not going to solve, nor do I even wish to attempt to persuade anyone to the contrary on here, but I will say why this always has been a nothing burger for me in Pokemon, but is a massive red flag in Palworld. In a world where the Pokemon world was even close to one-to-one with our own, you'd at least certainly have a case for the latter. A human telling an animal to fight is indeed dogfighting, something worth decrying to be sure. That said, Pokemon are very clearly not real-world animals. I have never seen an animal with the level of sentience that Pokemon have. It's one thing for your dog to know how to shake your hand or even learn to open your doors. It'd be an entirely different thing for your dog to be able to quite literally engage you in conversation in the language you speak. Having said that, it has been established that these extremely intelligent creatures enjoy fighting, not at all dissimilar from the way a professional boxer or MMA fighter enjoys fighting. However, that doesn't account for the trainer aspect. Pokemon are captured by people who then become their trainers. That again, in a vacuum, not great. But in the Pokemon world, even this is ultimately optional. Pokemon have been shown to be able to exit their Pokeball at will.
Let's get this straight! I do not want to be anybody's Pokemon!
They even have been known to outright refuse being in one to begin with, as well as choosing to leave their trainer altogether. So again, intelligent, sentient creatures choosing to form and in certain instances end these relationships. And I mean, how many of us have pets? They can't even make those decisions, and I'm sure you and most wouldn't entertain people yelling foul play about this dynamic, and they don't even have the say-so Pokemon do. Again, I don't bring any of that up to try to convince you to not discard the world that is being sold to you by the people that created it, or to not buy into the subtext. I bring that up to contrast that with Palworld, a game that allows you to not only quite literally force your pals to fight and work in what the community gleefully referred to as sweatshops, it also allows you to capture and force humans, albeit with a soft message informing you of the practice being frowned upon in Palworld, to do the same in addition to butchering them. Can't forget about the butchering. And because there's no good place to put this in this script, but it still deserves mention somewhere, there's a bestiality pal. It's number 69 in the pal deck, and since it's the funny haha meme number, we're supposed to just write it off as funny? Similarly, the best read here is it's meant to poke fun at Pokemon like Lopunny or Gardevoir. The crazy part is the only actual cursed part about these Pokemon is what creepy fans do with them on the internet, which again is entirely different from the creators of the video game very directly creating a pal that they wrote into the lore has sex with humans. There's no subtext there. Even if Pokemon's creators intended to create the world people cynically picture in their head, it's an entire step further to then include those things like this, animal cruelty, or human slavery in that equation. And it's not Palworld participating in social commentary. Even if it were, still wouldn't be great, to be clear. There's no drawbacks to engaging in it. In fact, most of these things make the game a lot easier to play given the increased efficiency when accruing and defending resources. Beyond that, it's just there to provide the shock value they're using to sell their game to edgy, scorned, lapsed Pokemon fans, which I think is gross and ultimately is the reason that I don't see myself ever playing it again. I don't judge people that do, but for me, that's a deal breaker, even as a meme, or if the intent was to be social commentary that was just terribly executed, I'd rather not support it, and I'm honestly happy I could try it via Game Pass to make this video, in spite of the version's relative flaws, if only for the fact that it allowed me to not give this game $30 of my money to find that out. Thank you to Redirect's first ever executive producer, Trev L. Steinberg, and all of the other great names you see scrolling on the screen for keeping this channel afloat. If you'd like to join them and get other cool perks like exclusive content, access to community events, Pokemon themed merch, you can find all of that and more at shop.watchredirect.com, linked in the description. Or the best way to support, subscribe and ring the bell to be notified whenever new videos go live. Okay, that's it for me. See you in the next video.